I think that most architecture schools, what they don't do a good job of is teaching any kind of business, marketing and management, financial side. Those change your thinking about how you run a business. But probably more importantly, the computer side. I was always a techno geek. Whatever technology was coming next and always explored it probably before most other people. When I went to architecture school, me and a friend were probably some of the first people who used AutoCAD or anything at all. One of my partners, Michael Sammer, he originally had Studio Troika, and we both had partners who left and we merged together. He was at a restaurant in Lithuania. That was the name of the restaurant. But when he researched what it meant, it's a 3-horse sled. None of us are Russian, but it's basically a word for teamwork, because if you have 3 horses pulling a sled, if they're not all working in unison, the sled's not going in the right place.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Design Development, your hub to learn direct from top performers in real estate development, design, and construction. I'm your host, Rens Hayes, founding partner of H&O Lifelong Learner, and I am personally obsessed with high-powered organizations and the leaders that guide them. If this is your first time listening, thanks so much for joining us. And if you're a returning listener, can't thank you enough. Let's go.
I'm excited to introduce today's guest, Rob Elfer. Rob is a partner at Studio Troika, a Boston-based architecture firm. They work across a number of disciplines: retail, restaurant, office, lab, you name it, they can do it. They're super client-focused, and that experience in the design process is really where they focus on differentiating. Very unique to Rob's experience, and part of the story I'm excited to share is he really has influences in who he is today and his design from around the world. He worked in Montreal. He grew up in Montreal. He worked in Paris. He's worked on stadiums. He's worked on high rises. He really has influence from internationally recognized individual architects and companies, and it's really helped shape who he is as an architect, and it really comes out in that passion that I talk about. He's so passionate about architecture, and I absolutely love engaging with people that just love what they do. Rob, one thing I'm so grateful for your support. He's an avid supporter of design development, and for that I'm really excited to share his story, and I know it's one that you're going to enjoy. And if you know somebody in the industry that would enjoy this conversation, that would benefit from the conversations we have here on design development, please like, share, and comment on these episodes, because it's the only way we're going to help more people. And without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Rob Elfer. Please join me in welcoming Rob Elfer. Rob, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Rens. I've listened to your podcast a ton, and it's one of my favorite on the market. So
Love that. Love to hear it. We're having a great time with design development, and it's been since November, so we're coming up on a year, and I'm even more excited for year 2. These things gain momentum.
Yeah, I can't wait till you go national on this as well. There's no doubt that's coming.
So, Rob, I like to give an introduction or let the guests tell the audience a little bit about themselves and their company. You've been a partner at Studio Troika for years now. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your story.
My story is I'm accidentally in Boston. I'm originally from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And I worked in Paris upon graduating McGill University in architecture in 92. And I came back and decided I'd go to New York. And my fiance at the time came with me. And I picked up in newspapers. Back in the day, we actually looked for, the gray hair tells you that you look at newspapers for jobs. Curious. And there was an ad for an architecture firm that I hadn't heard of, but now I remember is Graham Gunn. They're pretty well known here. And they're looking for an architect who could speak French to work on a project in Paris. So I called them up that day and said, hey, just out of curiosity, I'm on my way to New York, but what's this about? And I was on a plane with them 2 days later to Paris, working on the project in Paris. So that's how I ended up staying in Boston. But yeah, originally I'm Canadian, and probably a little bit of that'll come out eventually in this talk.
Yeah, we'll look forward to it. Studio Troika, what markets do you guys work in? What's your primary focus? How many people do you have?
Yeah, so we are a very slow growth firm. We have this is actually incidentally as the company the 20th year, so we've been a little slow getting that out.
Congratulations.
Yeah, it's kind of weird to think about that, 20 years, but we're a mid-20s person firm. We've been slowly but gradually growing as a firm. We like to grow organically and not quickly, so there's not a lot of road bumps in our path. Our firm is was started and really are the genesis of being a true design firm. It's really about design, not with design with an ego, but with design as a value component to it. We really believe in that. Like one of the big influences for me was a book called, actually, I don't remember the name of the book, but the company is called IDEO, and they revolutionized shopping carts. Remember the shopping carts? They came out with these little short ones that are very vertical.
Yep.
This whole analysis, this design concept of like, how could we do that better? And they analyzed the whole system. They came up with this better shopping cart, and that fundamentally was a really important book and insight into what design could be. So that's the kind of firm we are. We like to think of ourselves as critical thinkers. Every project is sort of a problem that we're trying to solve with a client. It's important to them, and we try to do that well. So we do have expertise. We work in a lot of different vertical markets, but we sort of tackle them one at a time. So about 8 years ago, life science became one of our vertical markets. Incidentally, only because a company called Ginkgo Bioworks came to us and said, "Hey, you designed this really cool cycling studio. Could you do our lobby?" And we said, "Sure." And we've been working with them for 8 years nonstop since that point. And we've learned a tremendous amount. And I think what we're good at, and all the people here are really good at, is we hire really smart, funny, talented people. And that order is really important to us. People want to have all those attributes when they work here, because that's what our environment is like. It's very funny. People are really, really smart. I can't believe how, with the stuff that some of these people come up with. And you know, the general idea is that you can tackle a technical problem. You know, how do I do a lab? How do I do a dentist office? How do I do hockey stadiums? Right now we're working on a ski mountain. You know, these things are all things that you can learn. So it's less the expertise in a specific vertical market and more that people want to come to us because we're critical thinkers and we think uniquely about projects. And I think that's what people really want.
You explained that extremely well. In the design world, architects, engineers, it's easy to want to be niche and say that we do multifamily or lab, but you really come across, and you and your company, Studio Troika, really come across as a design-oriented firm that has kind of their hands into a lot of different markets, but their differentiator is the client and the design process. And I really admire that about your firm. And I think it's really cool to hear that a book about shopping carts like also impacted. I think that's a really critical lesson or takeaway for any leader or forward-thinking person, is you take lessons from all areas in life and apply them to other parallel situations. So in innovating a design card, how do you innovate and design in a building and the impact it can have? I think that's a really cool correlation.
Yeah, and I think you could bring that design logic, so to speak, to almost any kind of a project type. I mean, I think people ask, what do you do? I think I sort of generally say we don't do assisted living facilities and we don't do hospitals, because they're either kind of sad, or they're just not markets that they're so focused and so specific that we're like, we're not going to do that. Not that we wouldn't do it, but there's too many other things that we do and that we do tackle. And it's real, from housing to labs to sports facilities to, we do a lot of hospitality, retail, restaurants, bars. It's fun. And I think that's a general thing, is people here want to work on projects that are fun. So that's kind of like, is this going to be a fun project for everybody involved? Great client, great team. Yes. Okay, great. That's a great project for us.
Love that. Later in today's conversation, we're going to dive into some of that culture, because the fun, the positive environment, I almost would define the culture as vibrant.
Yeah.
That's apparent from working parallel to
I appreciate that.
You're also a connector of people in the industry. You organize ski trips, you organize ice hockey games. Now, most recently, they're happening at the Warriors Arena over off the New Balance off the Mass Pike.
Yeah, I hear one day you're going to play with us too, Ren. So
one day I got to dust off the gear and get out there.
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I came to, as I mentioned, I came from another place, came to Boston, worked for 11, 12 years, and then decided to start my own firm in an ex-partner's attic, which is always successful with at least one child and a pregnant wife. So that's how I started. And the one thing I realized I learned is like, hey, geez, I got a great design background working for some really world-class architects in the world and in Boston. Well, I have no idea how to meet people. I don't know how to make projects. And not being from here, I didn't have a lot of connections. So I joined the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce. They had a life science group, and we would meet, and I learned a lot. And I met some really interesting people who kind of really taught me how to network and meet people. That's probably the least intuitive thing for an architect to do, to be honest. I think we're really good makers, we're really good thinkers, but that side of it, how do you build business? That was new to me. You don't learn that in school. But I got pretty good at it and realized, you know what, I actually enjoy this. I enjoy that part of building the business, because at the end of the day, you're not, what I really learned is you're not networking, you're building relationships. And you start to build relationships with people, people like you, people we work well with, but we also like and enjoy and appreciate and learn things from every day. So what I started to do is start to think about, what are the things I like to do rather than networking events that, they're fine, but, do I need to go to an award ceremony? That's a pay to play thing. So when I first started about 5-6 years ago, as I got back into hockey, being, a typical Canadian who grew up with skates on their feet, I said,
yeah, I was going to ask. That was a big part of childhood, I imagine.
Yeah. The only problem is I was a goalie, and then now I'm playing out and I have no idea what I'm doing, as you'll see one day when you play with us, but it doesn't matter. It's fun. Playing hockey and men's league hockey is that, people just get along. You have people from all walks of life, and they just love that whatever that event is, whatever that sport is. So, the hockey league, so to speak, is once every couple of months. I've been doing it for about 5-6 years. Anybody out there who wants to jump in, it's an open networking environment. The idea is, it's not one architect and one contractor and one structural engineer. It's open to everybody. Let's connect as colleagues, rather than, and it's something it's sort of a side shift. It's the one thing I always found about Boston is everybody here is very competitive, but where I'm from, people are colleagues. And I really like that kind of collegial concept of, why do we have to think of everybody as a competitor? I'm friends with other competitors in architecture firms, and people sometimes see us together and they go, you guys are talking to each other? And I said, well, yeah. How else am I going to learn how to do what I do better if I don't talk to somebody else who does it?
And we have a shared passion, right?
Yes, exactly. But then the most recent one with a few other partners, we created Bush League Ski Club, which I just took off like crazy last year. And we're very excited for the second year coming on. And yeah, it's the same kind of concept as like, it's an open networking idea. You have people from all walks of the industry on the real estate, construction, design, brokerage side come together, and they ski together. And it's a great network. It's kind of like golf on ice, right? You get to spend, 5 minutes going up a chairlift with somebody and have a really discreet conversation. It's fantastic. So yes, I love connecting people and, working towards, that ever expanding that network. I think it's really important and fun.
Great insight. You moved to Boston, like you said, having no real network. You didn't have any base foundation here, and you had to create that through networking, getting to know people. And here you are, you said 20th year anniversary with your Boston-based firm, and you're creating networking events that would make it easier for emerging leaders and for people in the industry to build a network. I think that's a great full circle there.
No, absolutely. Because we have those emerging leaders here that we recognize. So, what best way to teach is by example.
Yeah. And you mentioned the competition thing. I think there's part of us, I know me personally, I'm very competitive, but similar to your sentiment there, doesn't mean you have to have be vengeful or spiteful of all of your competitors. We're an engineering firm. It's not possible for us to serve the entire Boston market, let alone the entire country, entire world. Of course, there's got to be other providers in the industry. Why not collaborate and see if you can raise the bar?
Yeah. And honestly, there's many projects we do that are collaborations, and we do a lot of national. We work with other firms that we found are good collaborators with us. Sometimes we're the design architect. Sometimes there are other people coming here and we're the technical execution architect. It's all about collaboration. As you just said, there's so many projects, both locally and nationally. You can potentially do it all.
Love it.
Why would you want to? So yes, collaborations are key. And I love talking to other colleagues.
Concordia University. You went to business school, and if I read this correctly, you got a business degree in business commerce. What did you think your career would look like?
Well, to be honest, I actually really always wanted to be an architect. But when I was younger, I played in a lot of bands, and that was really what I was doing. And my grades weren't quite good enough to get into architecture school at the time. And so I did what I call my penance degree.
That's degree.
But I did a degree. Yeah, I did a degree in, it was actually called Management Information System. It was kind of a hybrid between computer science and business. So strong computer science background with a business component to it. And I got so much out of that later that I'd never realized would be helpful at the time. But the long-term goal was always to go to architecture school.
So you always knew that you were going to architecture school. That's really cool.
I pretty much from when I was a little kid, just always wanted to be an architect.
Any insight, like what was the aha moment that you knew architect was your thing?
You know what it was is I was in 1967. So it's probably a lot of listeners don't know those dates because they weren't born, but they had the World's Fair, and I was 2 or 3 years old at the time. And I still remember my parents, it was all these incredible buildings that all these famous architects would build. It was, exhibitions. Some of them still remain there right now, but at that time it was incredible. And I was so struck by, these crazy buildings and spaces and styles, and the way people would, the way people interacted with buildings fascinated me. And I think that just always stuck with me. That was always there.
Love that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Hey, lessons from this, you mentioned some of those things, you carrying lessons. What were your big takeaways from this business degree that kind of stick with you today?
A couple. I think that most architecture schools, what they don't do a good job of is teaching any kind of business side to it. It's just really not a thing. And so when you have classes in, marketing and management and, the financial side, obviously, those change your thinking about how you run a business. They teach you a little bit about that, which says that you don't get in architecture school. But probably more importantly, the computer side. I was always a techno geek. I just always loved whatever technology was coming next, and always explored it probably before most other people because I just love that stuff.
Yeah.
I understood things a lot better when you learn how to program an assembler, which is zeros and ones. You start to be able to tackle a lot of stuff. So actually, when I went to architecture school, me and a friend were probably some of the first people who used AutoCAD or anything at all.
Oh, wow.
And I rarely, even from my time when offices would draft by hand, I was always on computers.
You were on a computer.
Actually, a funny story on that, if we have a second, is that my first architecture job was in architecture school. It was a firm called Saya Barbarez in Montreal, really, really great design firm. And only 2 of us got jobs that summer. There was a big recession. So that was when I graduated. Sorry. And we were designing like a goldfish shaped building. And all the floors were a little bit different, but it was weird geometry. And I was drafting by hand, and they went, "This is ridiculous." And I go to my boss and say, "You did this on a computer. You could do this in a day or two." And he looked at me and says, "Okay, kid, come back tomorrow with this building drawn up fully, or you're fired." I was like,
Oh, wow.
Okay. So I went home. I had a computer at home because I was, really into AutoCAD and that stuff. I actually sat there all night, drew up the whole building, came back. I came back with a floppy disk, and I said, "Here you go." And he looks at me and says, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, those are all the drawings." And I realized, oh crap, they don't even have a printer. So anyways, I ran out, got a printer.
Yes.
And printed it, came back. He looked at the whole thing, and he then went and bought like 5 computers and had me train other people on it.
You changed that business.
I changed that business by bringing technology into it, and people really never understood it back then. It's hard to imagine now that, in the early 90s, people were drafting by hand.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's changed a lot. But, I think the lesson of how to use technology, not for technology's sake, but how to use it to transform a process.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about that carefully, it's really, really can change everything in you. So we've used technology to change our process with people as much as our process with internally. And that's been a big thing for us from the very beginning. Using Revit, we started our firm on Revit 20 years ago. Very few people were using it at the time, but there was no way not to do that. So
yeah,
that's a big part with that.
It's a prerequisite now. Technology innovation. We think about where technology's come from the 90s to today, the last 30 years, and like to think about what's possible in the next 30, it's going to be exponential growth.
It's mind-boggling, but I was fortunate that led me to, I'm probably jumping all over the place here, but where I did work in Europe and other places, very early on, we were working with a program called CATIA in 1992. CATIA is the program that Frank Gehry used to bring into the industry to design, all his, crazy looking buildings, but it's actually aeronautical software. And the company I worked in Paris, they were using CATIA, and it was the hardest program to learn, but it was incredible what we could do with it. And then my last job before I started, when I founded which is Ocean, which then became Studio Troika, we were using CATIA again, but actually with Frank Gehry's team. We had Rick Smith, who came over, who's the guy who did all the Gehry stuff, and he worked with us to build this Kaufman Performing Arts Center in Kansas City in CATIA. And then when I started my own firm, it's like, there's no way I'm drawing in 2D AutoCAD ever again. But I couldn't afford that program, so we used Revit early on. But again, I think that all comes from those early foundations of not being afraid of technology.
Yeah, it's well said. Not being afraid of technology. Like there can be a learning curve, but once you get over the hump, it's such an asset.
It's a constant quest to improve how we do things is really the basis of everything. It's like questioning, why do you do that way, and how do you do it better? And that's the constant for us. And that's technology, that's process, that's how to deal with people. It's a constant quest to do it better.
Change is constant.
Yeah.
Early career, you hinted at some of the stories there. You jumped around a little bit. So the 12 years as an architect leading up to when you launched your first firm, you worked for 5 companies in 12 years. Can you share some insights there? What the different experiences, why we jumped around?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think I shared that I started working at that firm in Montreal and brought computers, and my girlfriend at the time, Natalie Belmar, who's an architect and project manager in the local area as well now, she got a job in Paris. And then she said, hey, why don't you come join me? So I went to Paris. I didn't know anybody there, and actually printed up 50 resumes and dropped them off walking around with my portfolio around Paris. This is pre-internet, right? So you're not emailing anybody, So, but I got a job there.
Good lesson right there. Nothing's handed to you. Like get out and go.
Again, it's the same thing as networking, right? Just
yes,
find a way. So I was like, I loved her. I wanted to be with her. I went to Paris. That kind of love story. I'm in Paris. I'm doing that, and I work for this company that has a truly incredible project. The old president of France used to have what they called les grands projets, which were like national projects. And I got the fortune of working on one of those for about 3.5 years. And intermingled with that, we worked with Rem Koolhaas, who's a famous Dutch architect who set up shop in our office, and we worked together with him in a sort of collaborative environment to work for the Stadium for the World Cup in '98. And
what an incredible project to be a part of.
Yeah, it was just you're doing these things, and we worked on all these incredible projects, very competition based. So we would do endless competitions while we weren't working on those projects. You're working in Europe is a very, very different way of working in design than the United States. It's really less of the business orientation, more of the kind of the quote unquote old school master architect. And so it was very, very interesting. So I had those experiences.
Did they play the same role? Is it structured the same, like how an architect collaborates with an engineering team, a code consultant, the contractor, the owner? Is the structure of a design and development team very similar in Europe?
No, it's actually very different, but I think it's a good structure. In France, is which way I know the best, the architect is called the maître de l'œuvre, is the master of the work, and they're really in charge of the design and the design intent. But they bring design build components on early to have people help you. So a lot of design assist roles. So we would work with companies like Permis de Lisa that would do, we did these kind of crazy wild projects, right? So with some top engineers, we bring Arab on earlier for structure and just work with all these great people. They come on very, very early. You bring the project to a design development, funny for the podcast name, but you bring it up to design development. And at that point, the contract actually takes on a partnership in the CD role because they actually are in charge of the construction. So it makes sense. If you're going to be in charge of the construction, you may as well influence that side of it. I thought it was a pretty good way of working. And it kind of created a little bit more freedom. I mean, if you go to Paris and you look at the buildings there, they're incredible. So I feel like that type of environment fosters more creativity. So it worked pretty well. So it was very, very different. But then I eventually left Paris, came back to Canada and this Boston, and worked at different firms to try different things out. I actually worked at a company called, I started at Coleman McKinnell and Wood, a very famous blue blood firm that did City Hall and really great architects. But at that point, I decided, you know what, I really need to become a citizen to start my own firm. I can't do it with working on what we call the trade NAFTA visa. So I went to a company called Carlson out in Framingham, and I went to a place that I thought no one would want to go to, because when you apply for citizenship, there's a whole process. And if one person who's qualified comes in, you're kicked out of the process. So I went to a place that says, where's no one ever going to go? So I worked in that firm for a few years. What was really cool about it, it was an AE firm with a construction component. So we basically had contractors, we had engineers, structural, landscape, architects, all under one roof. And I got a lot out of that. I came in as kind of the design architect there, and we did some interesting things. But what I got more out of it was really just dealing with all these different people under one roof.
So you got to see how they operate and what they think and care about. What are they concerned about, right?
Yeah, and we became, a lot of our work now is a lot of design build. A lot of contractors come to us to partner with us. Some of the better projects have been done that way, and I think for a large part it's because of what I learned there. We're very good design build partners because I understand that. Okay, how does an engineer think, and what does he need when is a good time to have the estimator come in, and what do they need? You get away from the ego part of it, and you become friends and learn how to work with each other. So that was really good. And then it worked.
I like the idea of inviting the contractor into like design, whatever phase it is, even if it's towards the end, but having a goal in mind. Like, here's what we're trying to achieve. Here are the critical things that, like, these are the must-haves for our design. Here's the nice to have. Like, what do we have to work with to achieve the development goal within a budget?
Yeah, we're huge fans of having the construction manager and the entire team on at the outset of the project. There's just too many benefits to that model. We almost never work on projects that are essentially fully bid, because I just don't see the value proposition for the client. But the more we can bring on design assist partners early on in the project, the better options you can come up with. They're not going to be extreme from a cost perspective. We have to value engineer everything down. It's really, okay, let's be really thoughtful and get all the experts together and have a team. And those are my favorite projects, frankly.
Absolutely. To think, we learn so much from our past experiences, right? And then part of design development is sharing those experiences with other people so they can learn from them. Same thing applies to a development. Like, we all have a different experience in the industry and through a different lens. And if we can bring those all collectively to make better decisions and learn from each other's experiences, you would think you're going to have a better result. I would say you're almost definitely going to have a better result.
Well, I think with the tools we have now, especially the visualization, that, as you all know, we are very strong on we've been doing point clouds of all of our projects for over 10 years now. We bring everything fully into 3D, which is entirely our process. But what that allows is everybody else to come in. So all of a sudden the owner goes, oh, I get it. Most owners can't understand 3D visual space.
Right.
They're in it and they see it. But then I'm in a meeting and I might have, I don't know, the OPM or a broker say, hey, that's really cool. I wonder if you did that. And then we'll actually try it in the meeting live and go like, hey, that was a great idea.
So
all these tools in this process, everybody's on board at the beginning and you're working in that environment, you're miles ahead.
I applaud you for somebody that has such a great design eye and design process and really focused to, like, even you're welcoming that feedback in a meeting. And I think that's an astute point not everybody can visualize 2D drawings in a 3D space to actually contribute and provide maybe an idea that can contribute to the design. But when you can put them in an environment where they can visualize it and feel it, you're going to get new perspectives that help you make better design decisions.
Good ideas come from everybody. Doesn't mean that you've been an architect for 30 years or 20 years or 10 years and you have that training that, I'm going to see space and it's the only way to do it. You're going to have a great idea. You appreciate space, light. We all do these things. So why not invite everybody into the process? That's a big part of what we do, frankly. And it's just more fun that way. And
you're creating the environment for great design.
That's a great term. I got to steal that from you.
Creating the environment for great design.
I like
You
that.
mentioned like the design comes from everybody. You have experience Montreal, Boston, obviously, Paris, and I read Indonesia, China. You've worked on stadiums, on high rises, on all these commercial buildings and all these markets. That's got to impact your personal design experience, your personal design vision. You have all of these. You learn design from all these different areas and cultures. How do you carry that forward into your design practice today?
That's a great question. I think as you said earlier, every little thing you do in life influences you and gives you sort of just a different vision. Even before I did that, I traveled around the world for a year and a half between my Concordia and McGill degrees. I left Canada with $1,000 and just traveled around the world and all these different.
Love that.
And I just think like meeting different people and living in different cultures, you understand it a lot better than if you're just traveling. Like if you go to, I don't know, you go to Italy for a week and expect to really understand Italy in a week, it's not going to happen. You may eat some great food and see some great sights. You're not going to get a sense of what that place is like. So I think that working in all these different cultures and places, you understand the people, and every culture is a little bit different. The way they approach design, the way they think about space. And all those things have value, and it sort of creates this giant, I think, melting pot of ideas. But you never know when you're designing things, it's very, design is very, I don't know I'm trying to find the right word for it, but idea is kind of like when you're writing songs, right? You would, I used to be a musician and write songs, and like you'd have these influences from other things. You don't even know the influence is there, but it hits you. So I think the more of this that you have in life, the better, because it just gives you just an incredible grounding and a toolkit that you can start to use things that you're not even really thinking about, but they're just there below the surface. But you think differently. It's I don't know. I don't.
It's an influence. It's a great way to put it. It influences. It's hard to put into words. It's not necessarily tangible, but all of those influences and cultures that they have a big impact.
Yeah, it's a rich life lived, and lessons and feelings and those understandings. It's different as opposed to sometimes people are critical of like the Boston skyline, and it's more of the same, more of the same, more of the same. Where you go to other cities and you go, I don't know, my daughter goes to school in Toronto, and I go to Toronto frequently, and you look at the skyline there, and it's completely different. They have different kind of buildings, different design, aesthetic. New York is the same way. Boston had tended to be fairly provincial, but I think it's a lot of just very local.
What did you think about Paris? Paris is one of my favorite cities. And the feeling I got when I was there was almost like there was a collaboration of architecture across the whole city. And I thought that's what made it so beautiful.
Paris is nuts because architecture in that world is sort of viewed. They actually cover it on the news. So they actually have a segment on the news where they'll have fashion or architecture or design, which doesn't even exist. But I still remember taking a cab home one night, talking to the cabbie, and we start talking. I said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm working on this." "Oh, what projects do you work on?" I said, "I'm working on this grand projet I was talking about." And then we started with the cabbie, started talking for 20 minutes about the project. Appreciation.
Like everybody in the culture has an appreciation for design.
Yeah, because they appreciate the beauty side of it rather than just the financial side. They wouldn't know anything about, nor would anybody here if you really think about it. If you ask somebody to walk by a building and say, "Hey, what do you think about the financial outcome of that building?" For us, it's very important, right? Our clients, they want a beautiful design, but they want it on time, on budget, all the rest of it. That's what makes a successful project. But, the average person walking by the building, what they're judging is, well, what is this? How does it look? How's it going to be here in 50 years? Like the new Stack building that just went up in BU, that was one of my former classmates. And, bringing other firms into the city who have a different way to think, I think is really beneficial for our city. I'd love to see more of that.
Hey everyone, quick break from the episode. If you're enjoying today's episode, please send this to a friend, like, share, comment, subscribe. It's the only way we're going to help more people. Let's get back to the show.
Career at 5 internationally recognized design firms leading up into this. What were some takeaways? Like, what were the trends between the companies? Did they operate totally differently? Did you see strengths in one, flaws in another? Like, what were some of your takeaways from that experience?
Good question. They're all different. I would say that those type of firms, what we call starchitects, the Frank Gehry's of the world and Zaha Hadid's and all these type of people, and they tend to be driven by one person who are incredibly talented and very visionary, but it's really top. That's the pyramid. It's very, very strong in all those cases. But they're all very, very different, as I said. So some of those guys are different than others. So, for example, I remember when I was working in Boston, my last job was in Moshe Safdie's office. The guy was brilliant. We would be doing like 10 to 15 world-class projects, 50 to 300 million or more each one. And he can keep all this in his head and float around from person to person. And he would somehow remember the details of the project. It was incredible. You'd have this one-on-one interaction for a few minutes, maybe, but you learned a lot from that. But what really struck me was when I was working in Paris with Rem Koolhaas, he would get everybody together and get in a big circle and ask everybody what they thought about the project, including the model makers. And I thought that was really fascinating to sort of see, truly one of the most influential architects at that time. And he cared about what everybody thought. And I thought that was a big takeaway for me. Like, all right, you have a lot of talented people you're working with. How do you get the best out of them? Include them, give them, the days where architects spent like 5 years working on bathrooms before they're allowed to work on something else. That's not the case anymore. We hire some really insanely designed, talented people coming out of school, and they're just doing amazing stuff right off the bat. So those are the type of things I think I took from them. But they're all different. There's no doubt.
That's evident in our conversation today, right? Like you correlate, like you said, one of the most renowned architects of that time, getting insight from everybody in this company. And you shared that same type of environment in our conversation today. Steve Jobs at Apple, like what's one of his famous quotes, and I won't say it verbatim, but it's, you don't hire really smart people and then tell them what to do.
Absolutely. That's a great quote. We here like to think of ourselves more as a studio teacher rather than, the director of a firm. It's truly a Studio Troika. It's a studio. It's a true studio environment, and people are exploring and playing and coming up with ideas. That's the fun of it. Like let them do what they do well.
So the name studio in Studio Troika is intentional because that's it kind of is almost describing the environment.
Yeah.
Where did the name Studio Troika come from?
One of my partners, Michael Sammer, he originally had Studio Troika. I had started something called Ocean at the time, and we both had kind of partners who left and we merged together. At that time, it was about 2004, 2005. He had the name Studio Troika. I had the name Ocean. Studio Troika stood for, he was at a restaurant in Lithuania, I believe. And that was the name of the restaurant. But when he researched what it meant, it's a 3-horse sled. It's a Russian word for 3-horse sled. None of us are Russian, but it's basically a word for teamwork, because if you have 3 horses pulling a sled, if they're not all working in unison, the sled's not going in the right place. So I like the name of it. I thought, okay, that sounds really
what a story.
Yeah, that's really what and we'll talk a little bit later, but we're kind of working through a rebrand right now, and that's front and center of it. It's really about teamwork.
So we'll go pre-merger, starting your first company, Ocean US. Like, what led you to making this leap? What kind of pushed you to that direction?
So Ocean was, when I used to work in Paris, I hooked up with these guys from the Architectural Association in London, some friends of mine, and that's probably one of the better design schools in the world. They just do, Zaha Hadid came out of there, some of these really exploratory design firms. And what we did at the time, I moved back to North America, but I would work in the day at offices, and at night I'd work on these insane design competitions or exhibitions or installations more than anything else. And that group was called Ocean, and Ocean was made up of, there's a group in Scandinavia called Ocean North. There's a group in London called Ocean UK. And there was us over here, and that expanded. And really that only happened because of the internet. Once I moved here, it was the beginning of, 1994, 1995, all of a sudden the internet came into play. Now we could communicate. We couldn't do that before. So Ocean was sort of this international design collaborative. We would write scripts in AutoCAD and 3D studios to kind of create and explore different types of spaces. Mostly we weren't really doing buildings. We were exploring the concept of buildings in space and doing big international installations and exhibitions. one point when I was working in Moshe Safdie's office, I was in the same exhibition as him at the Royal Albert Museum in London, and that was a little awkward. That was at the point where I was like, maybe it's time. Maybe it's time.
Maybe it's time.
Maybe it's time. So I kept the Ocean brand thinking, I just transformed this into a commercial enterprise. Turns out doing really wild installations with Zaha Hadid in Vienna doesn't translate really well to the Boston architect.
Doesn't translate to the Boston.
It really doesn't. And, I had to realize we're doing house editions in Wellesley, and we're doing, the type of projects you do when you start up. So that was Ocean, and that was that background, how I came to that. Again, that the idea of a design collaborative, as you start to see that trend in everything I'm talking about, is the same thing. We were passing files back and forth across the internet with these weird scripted forms and communicating. There was no Zoom calls back then.
Yep.
There's
no Zoom calls. I've learned more from people outside of the architecture world, and I know I, for one, wasn't very aware of it. Kind of the angle of submitting designs to these national or international design competitions to get, could you share a little bit about what would encourage a team to go compete at a competition? Is it usually to win a job? Is it for prestige and status that you can then leverage to get a world-class project? How does that whole environment work?
I think it's pretty common in Canada and in Europe and in other places that projects are awarded through design competitions. Sometimes they're voluntary, so you just pitch in and do a competition and hope you win. Sometimes they're paid. So they'll bring a select group of 4 to 6 firms. They'll pay them a stipend, and they'll do the design, and they'll pick the winning entry. And I think what's really cool about that process is that it really allows young firms to get a great project, something relative. You would go after things that were relevant to what your capabilities are. But I remember in Paris, you'd have these great young design firms starting out. They got an opportunity to do this great little jewel box project that here it's much harder to do, right? You gotta find those. You got to find the client. So the competition culture was very, very interesting. We don't really do that here. It's less of, there are a few international competitions or national competitions like that, but they're few and far between, and it's just not our culture really. But I love that environment.
It seems very, it's intriguing to me, especially because people can really think outside the box.
Well, you could do concept design on things. Sometimes we'll do that as we're working on a few projects like that where they're just kind of exploring the concept of a project before they're really a project yet. So you get to play around with design ideas, but for the most part, there's no time in your contracts to do that. We're much more business focused in Boston.
Share the story of the merger between Ocean US and Studio Troika. How did you guys connect? How did that come about?
I had my second born at the time, and our daycare was at the Volpe Center in Cambridge.
Okay.
A woman came up to me who we both recognized each other from parties years ago, but she goes, "You're an architect, aren't you?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she goes, "But I think I've been talking to her that she's talking about house edition." So I was probably really pitching my services early on without too hard. And she said, "Well, my husband is actually an architect. We don't need an architect." And then we realized that we knew each other from a party years ago in Cambridge. He had a partner who left. They were just the two of them. And I had the same thing. I had a partner who probably wanted to be designing towers within 3 years of starting the firm, which was not going to happen. We still haven't designed our first tower, hoping, but not quite there. So we talked together and sort of thought about what the potential together might be. I never wanted to do this alone. I always thought there was merit in having partners. And we started, we merged the firms together, kept the Studio Troika name because I like the story behind it. And he did too. And then we grew. We went from, 4 people to 6 people to 8 people, moved from Malden to Boston.
Love that.
And
did you feel any risk in creating a partnership? How long did you know each other before you joined as partners?
I knew of him pretty well, and we had a lot of common friends. He went to the Harvard GSD, so he was a great designer, really smart guy. We both had, I want to call it, failed initial partnerships, which I would call it really failed. It's just a learning experience, really.
And that's a good way to put it. The experience, you almost find out what your where your strengths and weaknesses are when you have a partner. What doesn't work is almost more important than what does work.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing, right? It's like a partnership is like a marriage. You're going to have your ups and downs and rocky
Absolutely.
periods and love affairs, and that all kind of happens. But I think early on, just that shared experience of knowing what didn't work
I'm like, hey,
led to us thinking we could do it. And there was, I'd say it's always been a partnership of a certain amount of conflict and passion. We have very strong ideas, we have very strong personalities. We fight it out to figure out what makes the most sense for projects. But I think that at the end of the day, that just enriches things.
and like the past experience with your previous partnerships also gives kind of a new perspective in like making the next one successful, gives you new insights, and like you're looking for opportunities to make it successful. And I think that's really important. You have to value the partnership above everything.
Yeah, I think as when you go out on your own and you start a company, it's terrifying.
For sure.
It's a big
there's risk there.
Yeah, it's a big step. It takes a lot of belief in yourself, a lot of work, a lot of conviction that you can make this work, and just kind of you learn. I think the most important thing at the end of the day is learning how to deal with people. It's the hardest thing. The design part is easy. People are hard.
Yeah, people are definitely the hardest part. Like hiring, creating teams, creating the environment, like culture. We'll dive into that more, but those are the hard things. They don't teach that in school.
None of this is taught in school. It's incredible to me.
And do you think, thinking back to your education now, I know you mentioned like architecture doesn't. Do you think there needs to be more of an emphasis? And I'll preface that with the second part is like, could there actually be enough coursework to learn the lessons that you learned while you're doing it in business?
It's an interesting thought. I've always wondered why more of that isn't taught in school. But the problem with architecture is, I think engineering is more discrete, right? When you go to engineering school, there's a path that you take. And, I've always been fascinated that when you go to engineering school, you become a PE. You're not necessarily a plumbing or mechanical, you're PE. Then you specialize at some point in time. The problem with architecture is we have to have an incredible amount of knowledge about so many different things. Going to school in Canada, in McGill, we had 13 engineering classes. It was under the engineering department, one of the oldest schools in North America, but there was a strong emphasis on understanding engineering. So how do you fit, into that with materials and everything else in design? How do you fit running a business? I wish they would have done a better job at that, and I think they should. I think architecture school in general has to be a little bit more oriented towards, people who can actually work in the field rather than just design. People aren't prepped for a lot of the aspects of just, building code. I'm shocked sometimes people come out and it's like, how do you not know basic building code?
It's a good insight from like, as an architect, you really have so many disciplines and aspects of a building. You have to know a lot more than, say, a structural engineer or a mechanical engineer. You have to know a little about everything that goes on in development.
A lot about nothing, but a little bit about everything.
A lot about nothing, a little about everything.
Yeah.
Compatibility as partners. Any advice now? You've had a successful partnership for over 20 years. You're growing a firm, successful culture. What advice do you have for people considering their first partnership?
I think it's a really hard thing because you're going to go through ups and downs, right? And a lot of them. There's not a smooth path. You're always going to have disagreements. We've gone through, since we started out in around close to 20 years ago, 2008 came along, right? How do you deal with that? The great, whatever you called it, the minor depression, the Great Recession, all these terms for it. That was a hard time. So it's easy times are easy. A bunch of projects are coming in and, that you're working together and building things. So that's the fun part. The hard part is you have to have somebody who has the same values, your deep-rooted values. We're all actually fairly fiscally conservative here.
Right. Hey.
You have to understand that person has similar values to you, I think, because it's in the hard times. We had that, we had the pandemic. We've had, our bank was SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank that folded. There was a weekend there.
That's scary.
It's like, all of our money is gone. So you go through these hard periods and it's not obvious to understand how somebody's going to act in those hard periods. That's the most important one to me. Do you really have somebody who has your back in those in those moments, or is that just going to lead to infighting and everything will explode? So to me, it's a really, really important part of finding a good partner is how do you deal with the hard times? Analogy to a marriage, it's the same.
Phenomenal advice. It's absolutely true. And alignment in values, I think, is so important.
Yeah.
Those are the things that come to the surface during the hard times.
It's been interesting. I hope we don't have to have any more of them in my career because I feel we've had enough, but I'm sure there will be more. But
the next level of leaders can handle the next one.
Well, that's who we're trying to train right now. That next group.
Studio Troika. How do you differentiate in a world? There's a ton of competition. Excuse me. There's a ton of competition in architecture, in general, architecture, our business, engineering, development, real estate, very fragmented industry, which means there's a lot of service providers. Mm-hmm. Differentiating is really important. It's not better. How do you differentiate?
Yeah, I think the one fascinating thing about Montreal, Boston, we're not in Montreal, but anyways, there's a tremendous amount of talent here. Everybody calls themselves a design firm, and there's a ton of really good design firms. There's a ton of really good life science firms. There's a ton of niche experts, right? You're competing against really, really good people, and you have to understand that. So I think the one thing that we've done, I talked a little bit about sort of our beliefs, the technology side. And I think that's something that has always been a slight differentiator for us. But when we talk to clients and we sort of show them, a big part of it is like how we work, and we have a process, and it's taken us a bit of time, but we've actually really started to define our process. And that process, again, it came out of working differently, challenging the status quo. It's like, why do you deliver projects that way? Like, why the typical curve on, a design project has been kind of an arc that goes like that, right? And it's basically schematic design. You do more work in design development, you do more work in construction documents, you get a budget at that point, and then you go back to here and you go all over again. It makes no sense.
Totally agree with you.
So the other part of it for us was accuracy. You start off with inaccurate conditions and drawings, you're just constantly be fighting. So as I said about the two things that we did, which I think were a little bit different, aside from the design side, which is important, is that we started doing point cloud scans, 3D point cloud scans of all our projects, the outside, the inside, the neighborhood. We found a way to use that and make it a big part of our process, but no one ever resists doing that, the additional cost, because one dimensional discrepancy could throw a whole project off during construction. So our drawings are accurate from the get-go. And because we do that, we immediately jump to everything in 3D because we've modeled everything in the existing space. Then the big part of what we do from that point on, the programming and listening side is very, very important for us with the clients. So we understand what you're really trying to do, not what we think. We're not trying to tell you what to do as a client. We really want to understand the problem. And I think the biggest thing that we've really learned how to do is we do something called heavy schematic design. So when we do our schematic design set, it's more or less a DD set that's complete, design development set. And at that point, we want to invite a construction manager to provide a much more accurate budget. So our value engineering point is between schematic design and design development. It's not linear. At that point, we want to align the project goals, objectives, and budgets and design. And then from that point on, we continue moving on in a smooth line. And you've experienced that with us. We can shield our consultants from endless changes. And so our process is something we work really hard to define. I think that's one of our big differentiators. I also think one of the pitches that we make to people, but I think it's true, is that we're a good group to work with. People like us. They like working with us. We try to be smart but funny, keep a light atmosphere. You don't have to, we kind of call it great design without the ego. I think it's a big part of what we do. We can do all that, but we're not wearing bow ties and we're not talking down. I'm doing a lot of talking right now, but we try to do more listening than talking.
We spend a lot of time at work and in our career, might as well make it a fun environment. You want to collaborate with people you enjoy. I think that's a big part.
That's our atmosphere in-house. That's our atmosphere with our clients and our project teams. They should be good. They should be fun.
I want to applaud the design process and the focus because, again, I recognize the differentiator in design. Your team has a phenomenal design eye and does so across a multiple of disciplines. But to still take that design eye and put it into a process that still works for the business trying to develop a job in a budget or trying to, the commercial real estate developer. And you do have to separate design and production, because the pain point you described, taking a design all the way to construction documents to find out that the budget doesn't work, you're going all the way back down to the beginning and going backwards. You're wasting the time value of money is probably the biggest thing. One, the building's not going to be open at the same time that it could have been, right? So the loan on the land, the debt, the financial, the human capital that's focused on getting this deal done. Anytime we go all the way to the end to find out that it didn't work, we did a disservice. We made a mistake somewhere in the process. So to focus heavily and identify these opportunities to know that your development's going to work by the time you're at DD, I think is the best way to operate a design process.
I like to think that, the greatest compliment we ever get is from general contractors who know of us, and they say, oh, those guys have really good sets of drawings. And that's important. It's an old school approach to a set of drawings that is complete and coordinated as much as possible, rather than just rushing something out. We could have been a 40 or 50 person firm by now easily if we wanted to. We prefer to grow organically, but we don't want to start putting out bad products. It's really, really important to have those good sets and really tight coordination with people. It's quality, right? It's a flight to quality. It's not chasing. It's not you don't become successful by only chasing the bottom line. You have to know what you're doing well, I think. And that's something that's important to us.
I communicate design drawings have two primary goals. One, they're a set of instructions on how to build a building. Very clear set of instructions on how to do it. Second one is to make sure that they're capturing the full scope of that process so that there can be an agreement, a contract amongst parties between the person paying for the building and the person that's going to build it. And if you can't have a quality set of drawings, one, you're introducing risk into that relationship and introducing potential, because change orders, busting a budget, hey, we have 10 million and it ended up costing 13 million. Like, where does the extra 3 million come from? Really, really hard, painful conversation that doesn't help anybody. And when you can create a set of drawings and you have a relationship in the market where contractors can trust your drawings, that they're going to trust the brand, that the drawings are complete, you're going to get better pricing.
You're going to get better. You get better pricing because the drawings are more complete early on, so you can fix things that you would ordinarily be fixing in the field. I like to tell people in my office, like, if you can bring a problem to me at any point in the design phase before it's actually being built, that's a big gold star. Like, even if you're walking through a site and you notice something, but it's not built yet, you can still save that. But the second it's built, well, now it's a change order. Now it's complicated. So for us, we want to capture as many of those issues as early as and often as we can. And look, it's our industry is not perfection. No one can design to perfection, right? That's what a standard of care in a contract is. So, and clients don't understand that. What do you mean standard of care? Everything you do is I expect it to be perfect. It's like, well, actually, legally, it's not. You're not going to ever pay anybody enough to have a complete and perfect set of documents. But we want
to be flawed is to be human, right? That's impossible.
Yeah, you're best known for how you fix a problem rather than anything else, right? Problems arise. How do you work together? How do you fix it? Ideally, the owner never even sees the problem, as we have good relationships with contractors. So we sit there in the background and work it out. Ideally, the owner never sees a change order for it.
The design process, to me, is what mitigates that risk, right? We're going to get the big things right, and the other stuff is going to be small relative to the scope of the project that we can work through and so.
Yeah, and I think the dimensional control that we start off with is huge. That's been a massive change for us.
Completely agree. In existing buildings, you need it.
Well, even in sites, like we've scanned the exteriors of buildings and neighborhoods and find that the surveys are wrong sometimes. And we sit there and say, well, I think this is not correct where you position this. And then they come back and says, oh, you're right. How did you know? It says, well, we scanned it so I can measure that.
Technology.
So I think you build that foundation, and then from that, then you're not chasing your tail, changing things later, saying, oh, okay, this has to change. Because when you change one small thing, as if I have to pull something back by 6 inches in a building, well, that affects everybody. It affects you. It affects the MEP guys. It affects civil. It just, those changes need to be avoided. So dimensional accuracy is key, and then really, really good documents early on makes a huge difference for us.
design being a differentiator, the process, the client experience. How do you evaluate design talent during the hiring process?
Ooh, that's a good question. Um, hmm. So we've had people come in and interview that we've hired, and at the end of this say, "Do you want to look at my portfolio?" And we're like, "Oh yeah, sure."
Okay.
I think it's more. It has more to do with who the person is that we're trying to evaluate than what they've done in the past in design. I mean, of course, we're looking at things, and if somebody's showing us all this great stuff, of course, we love it. But what's more important to us is who's that person. I mentioned a couple of things, like how does this interview go? Are they smart? And you can tell that from somebody talking to them. You can tell that they're bright, they're sharp, right? They have a wit, they're funny. We're all laughing in interview. That was a great interview for us. Because the people in here, you can't really see in the background. It's 10:45 or whatever, but we all eat lunch together. Like,
That's great.
The entire firm for years and years and years, for 10, 15 years now, we all eat lunch together. It's the weirdest thing. Almost anybody. No, it's a family.
I've never heard of that.
No, it's a fun family environment. They're all friends. They get along. So when we're hiring somebody, we want people who are really smart, funny, who are going to get along with our culture. And to a certain extent, you're looking at things, you can sort of tell a person's design instinct. But at a certain point, what's more valuable for us is the other parts to it. I can teach somebody design if they don't really have that background in them. Like
something that can be learned.
Yeah, we have one of our people who's like, I just want to be a project manager. I like life science and project management. I don't like design. I don't ever want to do design. We're finally turning him into a designer now. We're not going to give up on you. You're eventually going to do design stuff.
We're not giving up on you.
Yeah, you don't come out of school being a good designer. You don't come out of working at, I don't know, one of the bigger firms in Boston. It doesn't mean you're a good designer. I think we can. Think of it this way: it's an ever evolving process. I'm not a good designer. I'm just learning to become one. I still am. So, but the personality, that's key to us.
Constant improvement.
Yeah.
Developing leaders. We're entering the next phase of Studio Troika. Can you talk to us about the importance of developing leaders and what steps you're taking to do that?
Yeah, so I think over time, what we have learned is when we bring, let's call it more experienced people from outside in and we hire them, those hires don't usually work really well. And I think it's just that we've learned that it's kind of the analogy to as a baseball team in the farm system. We're better off bringing interns in, bringing people out of school and constantly growing that pyramid of experience. But starting here, because we think that somebody who works here for 3 years, average person here works on 3 to 6, 7 projects at a time. You're constantly moving. You might work on a lab one day. You might work on a restaurant the other day. You might work on an office space the next day.
Keeps life interesting.
People like that. So we hire the people who like doing that. Not everybody likes that. So that's a key. But what we realize is that, you can't just keep building, but having the top be flat. And we always realize that you have to plan for the next phase, right? So my 3 partners and I, we're all in our 50s. We're not ready to retire anytime soon, but you want to start to see that continued growth. And we realized at one point we weren't creating the opportunity for that growth. So about 3 years ago, we named 2 junior partners, and they've really taken on a strong role. But we also had 2 other people named associates. We had a pretty flat hierarchy before that. But we realized, okay, we really need to have a little bit more hierarchy in the office as we grow as a firm. So we created a leadership team out of that. And the funniest thing about the leadership team is, although 2 are junior partners and 2 are associates, we'll probably become partners eventually. There's only so many partners you can have at once. But they've taken on such a strong role. They don't differentiate between themselves. And this leadership team has actually brought us into that. So where we used to have our own distinct meetings, now that leadership team is really the front of the engine in our planning right now. We run everything by them, we run everything through them. And it makes a ton of sense because these people are all in their 30s. They're young. They have a different view of the world. They understand people today way better than we do. And that growth has incredible benefits to the firm. It's kind of created that bridge to us and makes us, I always like to think planned obsolescence. The quicker I can become obsolete in this firm, the better. because that means other people are growing into that role.
100%.
And the most gratifying thing is now people are calling those folks for projects and not us. I remember when somebody said that on one of your podcasts, which it really stuck with me.
D'Artagnan.
D'Artagnan, yes, that was a really cool. And he said that, and I was like, yeah, I can't wait till that happens. And that just finally started happening with us.
Amazing.
Exactly when clients are calling them, they're going to be ready. So our whole goal now is to get these folks ready to take over, become part of it, and eventually and allow this to go. And we're called Studio Troika. We're not called the name of a firm. Ashen or whatever. The goal is that it allows those people to grow into that. So it's been an incredible learning experience. Hard for us to give up to an extent.
It is hard. There's nothing easy about it.
No, that's new learning for me. That
important decision or important takeaways in your process there. One you made, you were aware that you needed to plan for the future. I think every company needs to have time set aside in their year, their quarter, their day or week to be thinking about how is what we're doing today impacting the future health of the company and everyone that works here. And a theme throughout today's conversation has really been, I would say, inclusive. You're always inviting people into the process, inviting people into the design, inviting people in to make the culture what it is. And here you are transitioning to the next level of leadership. The piece of advice I want to highlight for leaders out there is you're inviting them into all of the partner meetings, all of the decisions that the firm's going through. And maybe they bring some insight to the meeting that helps you improve your decision-making. But more importantly, even if you're confident about the decision, inviting them into the decision-making process allows them to learn from the experience that puts them in a better position to make the decision on their own or with a new team later on when you're not there.
It's incredibly gratifying to see that happen. I got to be honest. I look at this and go, okay, this is really the next phase of my career is continuing to teach people. I think we're big on the concept that we're always teaching. And just as you said, that inclusion, it permeates. There's a culture we built here at the end of the day, right? When you start a firm, you build a culture that I think something I didn't say, but I meant to say that one of my takeaways of working all these architect firms is working 80 to 100-hour weeks. There's the one time in Paris I worked 42 days in a row on a conference.
Oh my God.
It was 12 to 16 hours. It's just the way it was. We were beaten. That was a thing in that kind of architecture. You worked and worked and worked. And when the project was over, they fired half the people and then they moved on. It was kind of the way it worked. And we sort of said,
can you imagine that people just agreed to sign up for that knowing they could potentially get fired in a couple of months? That's amazing.
Yeah, because you're working and building your resume, working for some famous architect, and you'll be able to leverage that for a job later on. I mean, that works. It's a part of the profession.
Here's a beautiful project. That's enough.
You'll get that in your portfolio. You'll have that experience. You can go to people and say, I worked on X for Y, and isn't this awesome? But what we learned from that when we started our firm is like, how do we start a firm that has a completely different culture and a different way of working so that, what would happen to me at the time would be I'd be sitting there working fiendishly along. And then on Friday afternoon, the big man comes along, looks at your design and says, okay, that's great, but change this and this and that. Let's look at it Monday morning. Now I just burnt all that time and I have to spend the entire weekend working to show it to him. It was an inefficient process. I don't think it led to the best design, but it challenged you.
When I hear 80 to 100-hour weeks, 60-hour weeks, I hear inefficient process.
Exactly.
Or oversight in managing workflow or strategic hiring. They didn't hire for the workflow that they signed up. They didn't have a plan on what they were going to do. That's what I hear. I hear organizational inefficiency.
No, but that's what we did with our firm. The idea was that, okay, let's have a firm where we value, I had kids. I started a firm to spend more time with my kids. Let's truly value work-life balance. And how do you achieve that? It's still a business, so profitable.
You've done it, yeah.
So let's think of a different process where we're not coming in the 11th hour and changing everything. So if I empower people well, and they're part of the process, they're part of the meetings, they're not sitting back here, they're hearing and listening. They're not wasting time. So how can we cut out
be the change you want to see? Be the change you want to see. And you've done that with your culture, your process, your people. I think
that's what we pass on is the culture we created, hopefully, is that everybody who's is bought into that completely. They're a part of it. They've helped build it now. And that's what they're going to take on. That's what they're going to carry on. And hopefully that's what this firm becomes known for is, just an incredible place to work. People love it here. They do great projects,
Mhm.
but they get to spend time with their family or go do whatever they like to do. And our office is almost never open on the weekend. I think in 20 years we're here, I can count on a handful of times how many times I've been here on a weekend because I don't want to be, and they don't want to be. So let's get everything done in a better way.
Advice, maybe it's the leaders in your company, but definitely the leaders, the emerging leaders in our industry, right? Those that are looking to be the next group of leaders. What advice do you
Um, I think I see that sometimes like every firm, occasionally people leave, right? They go to seek greener pasture. They want to work on this kind of project, and which is fine. I'm certainly bumped around, as you mentioned, 5 firms in 12 years. I don't think I realized that, but I guess I did.
have?
But I like to tell people to be a little, I like to tell the people here who are younger, be patient. You're all
Right.
going to end up within much less time than you think at very similar salaries. You're all going to be earning great salaries, doing great stuff. Be a little patient with your learning and really understand what you're trying to get out of this and learn. Like we do reviews twice a year, and they're really long.
Okay.
They're an hour long. Sometimes they're 2 hours long for each person. What we try to get them to do is like, tell us what your goals are. What are your goals for this year? And then what are your goals in 5 years? And what we're here to do is help you achieve those goals. So I think for younger people, I think you realize you're emerging leaders, really understand what you're trying to get out of that. Write it down. Write it down short, medium, and long term. Make that your focus rather than just jumping for a higher salary or for whatever reason. Don't just jump around for the wrong reason. Do things for the right reason. Understand your goals, I think, is one of the best things you can do. And also just what you said, be inclusive. We try to get all our people out to as many events and meet people as possible because that's what we're trying to teach. Collaborate and meet people. Have the best attitude possible when you're doing. Treat everybody well at the end of the day, and life won't be that hard.
Writing down your goals and what you want in your life in the short, near, long term improves decision making. For myself, when I think of my long-term goals, it actually allows me to make better short-term goals because, to your point, for the individual that might just be chasing a small bump in salary, if that small bump in salary is actually costing them their ability to hit their future goal, then it wasn't really a great move. You took a short-term reward at the cost of your long-term goal. But if you're writing these things down and revisiting, you build awareness to make sure that all of your decisions are kind of compounding for you in the long haul. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, it's important.
Closing out today, top book or podcast you'd recommend?
I just finished this book it's actually really a sci-fi author, Kim Stanley Robinson, but it's called The Ministry of the Future. And it's really about how the world adapts to climate change and actually works through it at a lot of different political and financial levels. And it's an incredible book, really, really deep read. But I just love reading about potential problems and how people deal with them. And when you think about them, something like, climate change on a global level and how that gets tackled at the World Monetary Fund level, it's just an incredible book.
A hot topic today for sure.
I'm fascinated by this type of stuff. I always have been, but it's just an incredible read. And it just teaches you about how to tackle a problem. And I think forever my favorite podcast has been How I Built This on NPR, Guy Raz. I just love that podcast. I just love hearing about just what you're doing, right? It's the same thing in a lot of ways. How do these people come up with their idea of their company? How do they grow? How do they deal with their own problems? You learn those lessons from different industries. They apply to all of us, right?
There's no one path, and we can draw from experience and in anybody's story. So it's all about that, sharing those stories. Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. I've loved learning more about your journey, Studio Troika. I appreciate everything you've built, how intentional you are and your partners are about the culture and the process and designs. Thanks again for joining us on Design Development.
It's a pleasure and an honor.
Hi, everyone. Real quick before you leave for the day, if we could ask one favor. If you enjoyed today's conversation, if you're enjoying all the conversations on design development, please share this with someone that you think will benefit from it. Our goal is to help as many people in the design, development, and construction industries. And with your help, I think we can spread the word and help more people. Thanks for tuning in and can't wait to hear from you next time.